Hello, this is Ace of Shades, and this is a tutorial on how to pick a lock. From the outside of the lock, you can see three main parts: the body or the Bible, the plug, which is the part that turns, and the keyway where the key is inserted. Inside the lock, there are pin stacks, which consists of a spring, a driver pin, which pushes down the key pin, and the key pin, which is the bottom pin that interacts with the key. This is what's directly lifted. The line between the body and the plug is called a shear line. When the key pin is lifted by the proper key, the driver and the key pin align at the shear line so that the plug can turn. Each lock typically will have multiple pin stacks. In this case, we see 5. Each pin stack must be lifted to the correct height in order to allow the plug to turn. Here we see it being lifted by the proper key. If even a single pin is out of place, the plug will be blocked. For example, if it's cut too low, a driver pin will bind, and if it's cut too high, a key pin will bind, keeping the plug from turning. When I say binding, I mean that there is friction on the driver pins or key pins that are in the way of the plug turning inside of the body. In an ideal world, this force will be the same. They're all stick at the same time, and they're all perfectly aligned, as you see on the left. So when you turn, they all bind. But the world isn't perfect, and there are errors in manufacturing and wear over time that cause things to not be aligned or not be all uniform sizes. Due to manufacturing errors and imperfect tolerances, the cylinders are typically slightly misaligned, as you see on the left. What this means is, when you turn the cylinder, one of the pins binds before all the others. This means that we can set pins to the shear line one at a time, and as you set one, the plug turns a little and the next one binds. But how do you set them? The way you do it is essentially, for each pin stack, lifting it up to the shear line while you're applying torque to the plug. You start with the binding pin, and the way you know that it's been set is there's no longer any pressure. It can just jiggle around. As shown here, it's loose. When it's not been set yet, there's still pressure applying down. Here's an animation of picking a 5-pin lock. We insert the tension wrench and apply torque, and then we go in with a pick. What you're doing is looking for a binding pin stack. When they're springy, as shown here, that means they aren't binding. The one that is binding doesn't want to move as much, basically. And when you lift it up, you'll eventually feel like a little bit of a click and maybe a tiny rotation, and that's how you know it's set. So you move on, checking other pins, see if they're springy or binding. You set another pin, and then you just keep looking for the next pin that is binding. As we show here, they're testing to see if it's springy or loose on pin stack 4 to see if it falls back down. Because if it's just loose and wiggles around, that means it's still set. And so you can know to move on to the next cylinder. Once you pick the very last binding pin, the lock opens. What happens if you lift a key pin too high? Well, it's called oversetting, and the key pin's going to get stuck, just like the driver pins bind, which means it's not going to fall back down. If you overset a key pin, you can try and let off tension and allow it to drop back down, although usually you just have to let off all tension and start picking from the very beginning. Here's an animation of oversetting and resetting. Pin 4 and 3 are set, then pin 5's lifted up too high, it starts binding, and it's not dropped back down, so they have to let off tension and restart. Now onto some security pins. This is called a spool driver because it looks like a spool of thread, and this causes a false set, which means the plug rotates a bit but doesn't go all the way. And when lifted, it just stops short of being set. If you keep pushing up on the pin, it gives some kind of counter rotation. It tries to force the cylinder back towards being closed, and then it sets, and then it turns more. This counter rotation is how you know you're dealing with spools and whether it's in a false set or it's actually set. And the video shows what this physically looks like with the plug. I hope this was informative, and I'd like to thank Tool and Deviant for creating all of the visuals in this presentation. Thank you, and have a nice day.